judge is divided into what we call three phases. All right, you've heard a little bit about this from the judge this morning, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth and ask you some questions about it. The first phase is what we call the guilt phase. And it's pretty straightforward. Those of you that have sat on a jury before, you've been through this. Basically, that's where you listen to the evidence presented during the trial. And then you go back and you deliberate. And you come up with a unanimous decision, which means that that deliberation must be unanimous. The jury must all vote one certain way for there to be an actual verdict in the case. Okay? Now, a first-degree murder case moves into phase 2 upon the jury finding a defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Then we go into phase 2, which is often referred to as what's called the penalty phase. During the penalty phase of the first-degree murder case, the state puts on evidence, and I know I'm going to use some big words here, and these are lawyer-type words, but they put on evidence of what's called aggravating factors, and then the defense puts on evidence of what's called mitigating factors. Okay? And then during the penalty phase, it's the jury's duty at that point to weigh those factors against each other, the aggravating and mitigating factors. And what they do is they must come up with a majority decision and make a recommendation to the judge of either life imprisonment or sentence the defendant to death. Now, I said a few important things there really quickly. Number one is a penalty phase does not require a unanimous decision of the jury. Okay, so when you go back there and deliberate for the penalty phase, as the judge said, there's going to be 12 jurors. So you've got to have a majority, one way or the other. So obviously, you've got at least 7 people that decide that the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors, and the jury comes back with a recommendation of death. Obviously, the flip side of that, there's at least 7 that believe the mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors, and you come back with a recommendation of life in prison. Now, the second part of that is, obviously, when somebody is convicted in the guilt phase of first-degree murder, there is only 2 possible sentences that a judge can give. Number 1 would be life in prison without the possibility of parole or probation. And the second option is to sentence that defendant to death. Okay? So that's basically what we're looking at here. You've got first-degree murder, you go through the guilt phase, you go through the penalty phase, and then the last phase is what's called usually the sentencing phase, where the judge takes the jury's recommendation of either life in prison or the death penalty. And then the judge is the one that actually sentences the defendant. Now, I don't want to make light of the recommendation because only in the rarest occasions can the judge actually go against what a jury recommends. But it's ultimately up to the judge in the sentencing phase to actually pronounce what particular sentence we have. Okay? Anybody have any questions about what we're talking about here with first-degree murder and the different phases of the trial that you'd be asked to hear if you want to jury? Now, before you came in here today, you may have had no idea what case this was. I know some of you did know, some of you found out, you told us that downstairs. Some of you might have thought you were coming in for a DUI case or something like that. And now you know we're here for a first-degree murder case. So I have to ask you some questions about the death penalty. Now, I understand that some of you may have some strong feelings, and you may think that the death penalty is not used enough. Some of you may tell me that you don't believe it should be used at all. And some of you may have never really thought about it because you never thought you'd find yourself in the situation that you are in today. But I've got to go into that, and I've got to ask you some questions, okay? So we're going to go through individually because I need to get each of yours. And what I'm trying to get here, especially with these first couple of questions, is I want to get your feelings. I want to hear your emotions. I want to hear what you feel about the actual death penalty in the state of Florida, okay? And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Rimmel. Do you believe that the death penalty is sometimes an appropriate penalty or punishment for some murder cases?
Yes, I do.
All right. Would you be willing to listen to the evidence as well as the law in determining whether or not it's appropriate in this particular case? Okay. Now, with you saying that, you're not telling me, are you, that you believe it's appropriate in every murder case, do you?
No, I do not believe it in every case.
But you do agree that there's some cases of which it's appropriate and you'll listen to the evidence to decide if this is one of those?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Brown, same type of questions. Do you have any particular feelings about the death penalty? All right. Well, tell me a little bit about that, what that means. Does that mean you believe it's appropriate in some cases? All right. Now, does that, I just take that to mean then, do you believe it's not appropriate in other cases? Okay. Do you believe there can be cases of a murder in a trial and where the mitigating factors may outweigh the aggravating factors, and somebody should not be sentenced to the death penalty. Mr. Kameen, how do you feel about the death penalty? Okay. Does that mean some of the time, you think some cases it's appropriate? Does that mean that in some murder cases you think it may not be appropriate? All right. So how would you tell the difference? Would you listen to the evidence that was presented to you to make that decision? Thank you. Ms. Galloway, do you have any? Let me just ask, do you feel it's appropriate in some murder cases that somebody is sentenced to death? For some cases, all right? Does that mean that you also feel it's appropriate in some murder cases that somebody not be sentenced to death? Do you have any particular opinions one way or the other about the death penalty? Ms. Williams, do you have any particular opinions about the death penalty? Okay.
But not in all cases,
When making that decision, would you listen to the evidence and the testimony that was presented in court to make that decision? Whether this is in fact one of those cases if we get to that point? Ms. Messer? So you think it's appropriate in some murder cases? Do you believe that, do you ever envision a situation where there's a murder case that comes in this courtroom and you don't believe somebody should get the death penalty? So you'll listen to the evidence and the testimony that's put forth to make that decision? Ms. Day, do you have any particular feelings or opinions about the death penalty?
consider it's something that you want to fight, that you'd be responsible to
Sure.
decide that I believe in the death penalty and I will weigh the evidence presented and make a decision.
So you believe it's appropriate in some cases? Thank you. Ms. Ford?
Yes, I do believe that some is appropriate in some cases and in others not.
You would agree to listen to the evidence and testimony and make the decision here from what you hear in this court? Mr. Hatch?
I think it's more clear on the right, but in those other cases, they're going to work.
And how would you make that decision? By the things that you hear in this court. Is that correct? Thank you, Mr. Hatch. Ms. Hatch? Do you believe in it in all murder cases? How would you tell the difference? Would you weigh those factors that I talked to you a little bit earlier about, the aggravating factors and mitigating factors to decide if this is one of those type cases? Again, there's no wrong answer here, guys, so if you don't believe in the death penalty, this is the time to let us know. We need to have an open and frank discussion about it. Mr. Moss, how do you feel about the death penalty? You believe it's appropriate in all murder cases? If you made it to this jury, you made it on this jury, how would you decide if this is one of those particular cases? Does that also include listening to any mitigating factors that the defense may present? Thank you, Mr. Moss. Ms. Craig?
I do believe that not in all cases. I mean, I have to hear the evidence and have to be in the case to decide.
But you wouldn't automatically, just if you found the defendant guilty, okay, so we talked about that first phase, the guilt phase, just because you voted for guilty during the deliberation, you wouldn't in your mind automatically